Hi, I'm Jeff Murrah, and I want to welcome you to True Texas History, where today we are going to be talking about the history of coffee in Texas. Well, actually, history of coffee in Texas and America. Texas is not one of those places that when you mention the word coffee that comes to mind. A lot of times people will think of Seattle, Washington, and other places. But actually, Texas has a stronger claim to coffee than Seattle or many other places in the world. But before we get into the story of Texas and coffee, let me go ahead and give you a little bit of background on coffee itself. The coffee was first encountered by the Western world about 1675. At that point, a fellow by the name of Franz George Kolchicki assisted Vienna in fighting off the Turks in the famous Battle of Vienna. Now, as part of that battle, after they defeated the Turks left coffee behind, and that became a commodity, and he took the seeds, and that began the first coffee house. Okay, we're going to leave the story of coffee and speed it up some to 1773. Now, it definitely played a role in the Americas, and it was here. Now, the thing that happened was as a result of the Boston Tea Party. You hear about that. The colonies needed a national beverage, and guess what it was? Coffee. Coffee was made the national beverage. Now, it's awfully strange it was made the national beverage when the coffee pot itself was not invented until 30 years later in 1803. Wonder how they made their coffee back then. But anyways, okay, 1803, that's when the coffee pot was invented. Now, the story of Texas and coffee begins just a few years later in 1819. At that point, the French adventurer, I like to call him adventurer rather than pirate, but some people call him pirate, Jean Lafitte, he moved into Texas, into Galveston, and took over the pirating operations of Michael Auray. Now, part of the pirating operations was that they would plunder Spanish ships. And essentially, they set up like your local 7-Eleven. They had all the products, and then they sold them to the colonists and the people that were in the Texas area. And he had a lucrative business because Spain considered coffee contraband, and coffee was one of those things that he was making money on there off of Galveston Bay. And eventually it got to the point where there were some legal hassles. How dare you prey on Spanish ships? So what they did, they went ahead and declared for the Republic of Campeche, and with them declaring that they were part of the Republic of Campeche, which was, in some ways kind of a made-up republic, they gave themselves letters of marque, which essentially gave the pirates permission to go pirating without having to go to court and fight all the court battles that are usually associated with taking things from other countries. And eventually the Mexican government, or, what would become the Mexican government, the Republic of Mexico, because it didn't exist at this point, they hired Jean Lafitte to start working for them. From Lafitte's viewpoint, it was a chance to prey on some more Spanish ships, so he was willing to go along with it. Now, in 1813, Dr. Philip Long and the Long Expedition came to Texas as one of the filibusters, and I've got a video on that. And they approached Lafitte for his assistance. Now, Lafitte refused to give assistance, but he did provide him with coffee. You don't often hear about that. And he wanted to create a Republic of Texas, and it didn't happen. But then later on, when Stephen F. Austin brought colonists in, one of the 300 was none other than Jane Long, Philip Long's wife. and she was well known for her hospitality there on the Gulf Coast, and she served her guests coffee. Uh, Now, another place where coffee started becoming active was in Nacogdoches, because it was there in 1826 that Adolphus Stern set up his shop, set up a store, and coffee was one of the commodities there. In fact, it was coffee barrels that were used to smuggle in guns that were later used in the Fredonian Rebellion. Um, And so that was 1826. And then just a few years later, a major policy change happened in the United States Army. What that was, under President Andrew Jackson, he officially changed the traditional allowance of rum, whiskey, or brandy to coffee. The soldiers were then given, their daily rations of coffee rather than booze. And anytime you do that, soldiers, they will take their supplies everywhere they go. And of course, they started taking it to various places where they had campaigns and were operating. And some of the U.S. soldiers ventured into Texas. Now, coffee was considered contraband at that point in Texas. The Mexican government refused to allow it to be imported. They wanted to have monopoly on it, so you couldn't bring it in or sell it over a certain quantity. Much like the marijuana laws that used to exist, where you get a slap on the hand up until a certain quantity. It was that way with coffee. But there was big business in smuggling coffee. And, one of the early writers, Noah Smithwick, talks about how many of the early settlers had smuggling operations, and they even went so far as to introduce coffee to the local Indian populations. Now, when Texas finally won its independence from Mexico in 1836, new opportunities for trade opened. And one of those that took advantage of the now legal coffee was Francis Lubbock. He later on became a governor of Texas, and he claims to have been the first person to have sold coffee in the new settlement of Houston, Texas. Now, the Lubbock brothers played a big role in Texas independence, and he was part of one of five brothers. Now, the next thing that happened, in 1839, just 3 years after independence, a fellow by the name of Charles Adams discovered, hey, here in Galveston, there is no customs broker. So he decided he was going to go ahead and sell his own cargo when his ship arrived in port. They didn't have some of the fancy operations now. And he decided to bring in coffee, and he brought in Brazilian coffee from Rio de Janeiro. And the coffee became a mainstay on the trade routes. Rio to Galveston was a big route. Now, it's quite interesting that within a year's time, by 1840, the price of coffee was twice as much in Austin compared to Houston. You didn't have coffee parity in those days. And coffee continued to be an important thing. When the war between the states erupted, Texans still wanted their coffee. And coffee use was important for both armies. Now, the Confederate government allowed the soldiers enough beans. They were supposed to be allotted enough beans for 6 strong cups of coffee a day. Although they typically didn't have that much coffee, that was in the books. And in order to get along without coffee, people kept trying to find all kinds of coffee substitutes. It's interesting that Colonel Fremantle, he was a British officer who made some observations in the South when he came through here, and he said the loss of coffee affects Confederates even more than the loss of spirits. Think about that for a moment. we were reacting more to the loss of coffee than the loss of booze. That ought to tell you something. It says, and they exercise their ingenuity in devising substitutes which are not generally very successful. Coffee was also a major player in the Battle of Sabine Pass. In the video on Catherine Dorman, I talked about how she kept bringing out coffee and donuts to the people that were there. And of course, the entrepreneurs operating blockade runners sailed in and out of ports bringing coffee along with some other supplies. Now, when the war ended, everything was in shambles. Somebody who was able to see opportunity in the midst of those shambles was Moritz Copperl. And he, because they were having problems with cotton, he shifted the emphasis in Galveston from cotton to coffee. And that led to a boom in the coffee market. By 1875, Galveston imported 35,871 bags of coffee through the port, the majority of which was Brazilian coffee. Now, I had to research that because I was always wondering, okay, I knew they had coffee, but where was it from? Was it Colombian coffee? No, it was Brazilian coffee. And since they had a lot of coffee there, this is where people like John Arbuckle got the idea of selling roasted coffee. Now, Arbuckle began his business in Pittsburgh, but there at the Port of Houston, and with the activities there, they had to find coffee to take out on chuck wagons. Now, Arbuckle is one of the best-known coffees. He managed to do a lot of marketing and get his coffee out west. Sometimes people refer to Arbuckle's as the coffee that tamed the West. And one of the things that they considered essential equipment on a cattle drive was your coffee grinder. Think about that. How many of your kitchens have coffee grinders? Now, Arbuckle's also made it a point of always including a piece of candy in the sacks of coffee, and many of those old cowhands used to fight over who got the candy out of the coffee. Now, one of the coffees that was popular in Texas was the Cheek Neal Coffee Company. Now, the Cheek Neal Coffee Company, they're no longer around under that name. They later changed their name to the Maxwell House Company. Now, Texas has still been a major player in the coffee area. In fact, the Port of Houston is one of 4 green coffee importing ports, because there are only certain ports that green coffee comes into in the United States, and Galveston is one of them, and it still remains an important part of the coffee market. And the import of coffee into Texas still impacts 25 million customers. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on Texas and coffee, and if you have questions, concerns, feel free to leave them below. I'll be glad to get to them. And until next time, vaya con Dios, my friends. Goodbye.